The air was cold enough to make a man's breath look like smoke. In the deep forest of northern Arizona, winter wrapped everything in white. The tall pine trees stood heavy with snow, bending gently as the wind pushed against their trunks. Every branch seemed to whisper as the icy wind swept through them. It was a quiet, almost lonely sound. The only other sound was the crunch of boots stepping on frozen snow. Samuel Burke walked slowly, one step at a time. He was a tall lumberjack with broad shoulders and a strong frame, but even strong men felt small against the endless forest. His thick brown jacket was covered with frost, and his scarf, once warm, was stiff from the cold. His hands were tucked inside rough gloves, but even those did not stop the freezing wind from biting at his fingers. The sun was already sinking behind the mountains, painting the snowy ground with shades of gold and pink. But the beauty of it meant little to Samuel at that moment. What he wanted more than anything was warmth. His face felt numb, and his legs were growing heavier with each step. He had been walking since morning, hoping to return to camp before nightfall. But a sudden snowstorm earlier had forced him off the main path, and now he was lost. Samuel was no stranger to cold nights, but this winter was different. It was sharper, harsher, the kind that could swallow a man whole if he wasn't careful. The silence around him was almost too perfect. No birds, no rustling animals, only the wind. It was the kind of silence that made a man's heart beat louder in his chest. As the last of the daylight faded, Samuel knew he couldn't keep walking through the night. His body was tired, and the cold was starting to sink into his bones. He scanned the snowy landscape, hoping to find something, anything, that might give him shelter. That was when he saw it. Between two massive boulders, half hidden by snow and shadows, was a dark opening. At first, it looked like just another trick of the light, but as Samuel squinted and stepped closer, he realized it was the entrance to a cave. It wasn't very large, but large enough for a man to step inside. His heart lifted with relief. A cave meant protection from the wind, and maybe even a place to build a small fire. He picked up his pace, though his tired legs protested with every step. Snow crunched louder beneath his boots as he moved toward the opening. When he reached it, a rush of cold air brushed against his face, but it was different from the wild wind outside. The cave air was still and quiet, and that alone made it feel safer. He peered into the darkness. At first he could see nothing, only blackness. He hesitated, gripping the handle of the small axe hanging at his side. It wasn't fear that made him pause, but caution. He took a careful step inside. His boots scraped against smooth rock. The sound echoed softly through the cave, bouncing back to him like a whisper. The floor was dry, which was a good sign. A damp cave could make a man colder than the snow itself. Samuel moved slowly, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light. The deeper he stepped, the more he felt the wind outside fade away. It was still cold inside, but it was a different kind of cold, and still and bearable. His breathing grew slower, and for the first time in hours he felt a small spark of hope. He ran his gloved hand along the rocky wall, feeling the rough surface beneath his fingers. It was solid, safe. He could build a fire near the entrance where the smoke could escape and stay warm through the night. But something made him stop. A faint smell hung in the air, not the sharp, wild smell of a cave, but something warm, something human. It smelled like wood smoke, soft and old, as if someone had made a fire there not long ago. Samuel tilted his head and listened. The forest outside howled with wind, but inside the cave there was another sound, faint, soft, like a breath. It was so gentle he almost thought he imagined it. His heart gave a small jump. He looked around more carefully now. His eyes began to pick out shapes in the darkness, in the curve of a wall, the uneven ground, and something else near the far side. A small pile of stones. And near it, a thin blanket folded neatly. Samuel froze where he stood. Someone had been here. Or maybe someone was still here. For a long moment he didn't move. His mind raced. He had walked for hours without seeing another soul, and he hadn't expected to find anyone in this part of the forest. The cave had seemed abandoned, but clearly it wasn't. He thought of turning back into the night. But when the wind outside roared again, he knew that wasn't an option. The forest would be colder now. The night would grow even darker. He needed this shelter, even if it meant sharing it. He took a slow breath and stepped a little further inside, careful not to make sudden noises. The cave felt alive now, not empty. His boots made small sounds on the rock floor, and each one echoed softly. Then his eyes fell on something small near the old fire pit. a pair of woven sandals, delicate and neatly placed side by side. These were not the boots of a lumberjack or a trapper. These belonged to someone different, someone who lived in these mountains in their own quiet way. Samuel whispered to himself, "Someone's here." His voice sounded strange in the cave, as if it didn't belong. He didn't know what to do next. His heart wasn't pounding with fear but with caution. He didn't want to frighten whoever lived here, and he didn't want to be turned away. The cold crept closer and Samuel pulled his jacket tighter around himself. His breath hung in the air like fog. He lowered his axe slowly, letting it rest against his leg. He didn't want to look threatening. His mind drifted to the stories the older lumberjacks told around the campfire, stories about people who lived deep in these forests. Some were hunters, some were families, and some were people who simply wanted to be alone. He remembered one man's story about a widow from the Apache people, who lived far from the towns, quiet as the wind. Samuel had listened politely back then, not thinking it was anything more than a story told to pass a cold night. But now, standing here, the story didn't seem so far away. A small flicker of orange light caught his eye. It came from deeper in the cave, around a corner. It was the faintest glow, as if a single coal still burned low in a fire pit. Samuel walked closer, slowly, step by step. His boots touched the ground gently, and he breathed through his nose to stay quiet. The glow grew brighter, warm against the dark stone walls. He reached the curve of the cave and carefully leaned to look around it. And there she was. At first, all he saw was a shape, a quiet figure wrapped in a blanket made of soft deerskin, sitting close to the small dying fire. Long black hair spilled down her back in a single braid, and her head was slightly bowed, as if she were listening to the fire's last whispers. She was not asleep. Her shoulders were still but not relaxed. She had heard him long before he saw her. Samuel's breath caught in his chest. He didn't say a word. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The snowstorm outside felt far away. Inside this cave, it was just the two of them, a lost lumberjack and a quiet stranger. He stepped forward carefully, making sure his hands were visible and empty. He knew he was the intruder here. This was her space, not his. The woman slowly turned her head. Her eyes met his. They were calm but strong, like someone who had spent many winters alone and learned to trust no one too quickly. Samuel felt a rush of thoughts. Should he leave? Should he speak? But his frozen lips only managed a quiet whisper. "I didn't know anyone was here." The woman didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her gaze was enough. It said, "This is my home." Samuel nodded slowly, as if answering an unspoken question. He didn't step closer, but he didn't step back either. He stayed where he was, letting her see that he meant no harm. The fire cracked softly, a single spark rising into the air. That small sound was the only thing between them. Outside, the storm grew louder. The wind roared like a wild river, but inside, the cave stayed still. Safe. Samuel knew this was his only chance at warmth tonight. But more than that, he felt something unexpected and respect. This woman had made a home in a place where few would survive. He didn't know her name, but he already understood she was not someone to take lightly. So he stood there in silence, waiting. Not forcing his way in, not demanding anything. Just waiting, like the wind at the cave's mouth. The woman tilted her head slightly, her braid shifting against her shoulder. Then, to his quiet relief, she did not send him away. She turned her eyes back to the fire as if saying, "You may stay, if you do so with respect." Samuel slowly lowered himself to the ground, keeping a careful distance. The warmth from the small fire reached his frozen hands. It wasn't much, but it felt like a miracle after the long, bitter walk through the snow. In that moment, without speaking a word, two strangers, one lost in the storm, the other living in the quiet of the cave, shared the same space. The night stretched on outside, but inside the cave, a silent story had already begun. The snowstorm outside grew stronger as the night deepened. The wind howled like a faraway train, sweeping through the trees, making them bend and shiver. Inside the cave, however, it was still and quiet, except for the faint sound of the small fire cracking softly. The orange glow lit the walls gently, dancing across the stone like tiny moving shadows. Samuel sat near the entrance, careful to keep a respectful distance from the woman. He could feel the warmth slowly returning to his hands and face. It wasn't a big fire, but compared to the freezing night outside, it felt like the sun. The woman remained near the fire, wrapped in her soft deerskin blanket. She didn't speak, and her stillness carried a quiet strength. She had the calmness of someone who had lived close to nature for many years, someone who had learned how to listen to silence. Samuel didn't try to speak either. He understood that sometimes silence said more than words ever could. Every few minutes he glanced at her carefully. She had high cheekbones, dark eyes, and hair so black it almost shone in the firelight. Her posture was straight, proud like a tall tree standing against the wind. She didn't seem afraid of him. She also didn't seem happy that he was there. She was simply watching. Samuel reached into his coat and pulled out a small piece of bread wrapped in cloth. It wasn't much, just something he had saved for emergencies. His hands shook a little, not from fear but from the cold that still lingered in his bones. He placed the bread slowly on the ground in front of him, not toward her but between them. A small offering. The woman's eyes flicked toward the bread, then back to his face. She didn't move. "I won't take your space," Samuel said softly, his voice a bit rough from the cold. "Just need to warm up. You can have this if you want." She didn't answer, but she understood. She slowly extended her hand and picked up the bread with quiet grace, as if she was testing whether he was truly peaceful. She didn't thank him with words, and instead she gave a small nod. A simple nod, but it meant more than any long sentence. Samuel felt a small, warm relief spread through him. It wasn't just the fire this time. It was the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't have to spend this night alone. He leaned against the cave wall, listening to the wind outside. The cave protected them like a giant hand cupping a flame. For the first time that day, his eyelids grew heavy. But just as he was about to drift into a light sleep, the woman stirred. She got up slowly, with quiet movements, as if she was used to living without making unnecessary sounds. She walked toward the entrance of the cave where the wind crept in, and picked up a small pile of wood from a corner he hadn't noticed before. Then she returned to the fire and began to feed it carefully, one piece at a time, the way someone who knew exactly how to keep a fire alive would. Samuel watched her, impressed. He had worked in forests for years, cutting trees, hauling logs, and building campfires. But she moved with a different kind of knowledge, not learned from work but from living. When the fire grew stronger again, lighting the cave in a soft orange glow, she looked at him and spoke for the first time. Her voice was soft but firm, like the steady flow of a river. "You are lost," she said. Samuel nodded. "Yes, the storm came fast. I lost the trail." She tilted her head slightly as if studying him. "You came far." "I work with the lumber camp," he explained. "North. I was walking back, but the snow—" He made a motion with his hands to show the wind pushing him away. She understood. She had lived here long enough to know the forest didn't care about a man's plans. The wind had its own path. "I didn't know this cave was yours," Samuel added quickly, wanting her to understand that he hadn't come to take anything. "I just needed a place for the night." She looked at him for a long moment. The fire made her eyes shine softly. Then she said, "This cave is not mine. It belongs to the mountain. I stay here." Samuel nodded again, a bit unsure what to say. The way she spoke was calm, but her words carried weight. She didn't see the cave as property. She saw it as part of the land, and she as its guest. That was something he respected deeply. For a while they sat again in quiet. The wind outside started to ease just a little, but the snow kept falling. Samuel thought of his camp miles away, and how his fellow lumberjacks were probably sitting by a big fire, laughing and drinking. But he didn't feel sad about being here. In a strange way, the small cave felt safer than he expected. The woman took out a small pouch made of soft leather. From it, she poured dried herbs into her hand. She placed them gently on a flat stone near the fire, and soon a soft, sweet smell filled the cave. It smelled like sage and pine. Samuel closed his eyes for a second, breathing it in. It reminded him of warm kitchens, safe places, and quiet nights. She noticed his curious gaze and said, "Keeps the air clean." Samuel smiled. "It smells good." She gave another small nod. Her words were few, but each one was steady and sure. As the night stretched on, Samuel grew more comfortable. He placed his axe on the ground far from his hand, to show he had no intention of causing any harm. The woman noticed, and a subtle change happened in her posture. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. She still kept her space, but there was less distance between them now. Not in steps, but in trust. The firelight made the cave feel smaller, more personal. Samuel felt he was sitting not just in a shelter but in someone's quiet world. After a long time, he decided to ask gently, "Do you live here alone?" The woman's eyes lowered for a moment. Her hand brushed the edge of her blanket. "Yes," she answered softly. "For many winters." There was something in her voice, which not sadness, not exactly, but the weight of memory. Samuel didn't press her with more questions. He knew what it felt like to carry things you didn't want to talk about. He nodded slowly. "It must be hard, alone in the mountains." She lifted her eyes and looked straight at him. "Not hard, quiet, the wind is a friend. The trees do not lie." Samuel smiled faintly at her words. They were simple, but they carried a kind of truth he rarely heard. Back in town, life was full of noise. People talking, arguing, laughing. Out here, silence itself was a companion. "You're brave," he said quietly. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. A log in the fire cracked loudly, sending a few sparks into the air. Samuel followed their path with his eyes until they faded into the darkness. The storm outside was starting to calm, but the night would still be long and cold. The woman pulled out another piece of wood from the corner and placed it carefully into the fire. Samuel, wanting to help, got up slowly and went to the entrance to gather more of the wood stacked neatly nearby. He brought it back, placing it near the pit. She looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment, then she gave a slight nod, the same kind she had given earlier. That small gesture meant something between them was shifting. They were no longer just strangers trapped in the same cave. They were two people surviving the same night together. When the fire grew brighter, the woman sat cross-legged and closed her eyes for a moment. Samuel didn't interrupt. She seemed to be listening, not to him but to the world around them, to the quiet breath of the fire, to the snow falling outside, to the heartbeat of the mountain. Samuel leaned back against the stone wall, feeling tired but strangely at peace. The forest outside no longer felt like an enemy. The storm was still out there, but in this small cave, warmth wrapped around him like an invisible blanket. He thought of how strange it was. A few hours ago, he was wandering lost and freezing. Now he was sitting by a fire with someone he had never met before, sharing warmth, silence, and a kind of understanding that didn't need many words. The woman opened her eyes again. She spoke softly, almost like a whisper carried by the fire. "Tomorrow the path will show." Samuel nodded. "I hope so." "You follow the river," she said, pointing in the direction of the valley. "It leads north. To your camp." Her knowledge of the forest was clear and certain. Samuel realized she probably knew these mountains better than anyone he had ever met. He felt a quiet respect for her grow inside him. As the night went on, their silence turned comfortable. No tension remained, only the steady crackle of fire and the sound of the storm outside slowly losing its strength. Samuel's eyelids grew heavy. He wrapped his scarf tighter around his neck and rested his head against the rock wall. Before sleep took him, he glanced at her one last time. She sat quietly, watching the fire as if she was guarding not just the flames but the night itself. Samuel closed his eyes, feeling safe in a place he hadn't even known existed that morning, and as he drifted into sleep, he didn't feel like a stranger anymore. The night passed slowly, but the fire kept burning and the cave stayed warm. When Samuel opened his eyes the next morning, a soft light was filtering through the entrance. The snow outside was still thick, but the storm had calmed down. Everything was covered in white. The trees, the rocks, even the small bushes that had managed to survive the winter. The world looked quiet, fresh and still. Samuel stretched his arms, feeling the stiffness in his shoulders from sleeping on stone, but even so, it was the best rest he'd had in days. The warmth of the fire had made the night bearable, and more than that, the quiet presence of the woman had made the cave feel less lonely. She was already awake. She sat near the fire, her legs folded neatly beneath her, watching the flames with calm eyes. She had the stillness of someone who rose with the sun every day, someone who didn't need clocks or loud bells to wake her. The moment she noticed him stir, her gaze shifted toward him. She didn't smile. She wasn't the kind of person who showed everything with her face, but there was no sharpness in her look either. "Good morning," Samuel said softly, his voice still rough from sleep. She tilted her head slightly in greeting. That was enough. He got to his feet slowly and walked toward the entrance of the cave. A rush of cold air touched his face, making him pull his scarf up again. The snow stretched endlessly, sparkling under the pale morning sun. It looked peaceful, but Samuel knew the forest could be unpredictable. What was calm now could turn harsh again before nightfall. He turned back toward the woman. She was carefully placing herbs into a small pot of snow she had collected. As the snow melted near the fire, a light steam began to rise. The smell of sage and pine filled the air again. She had created a home in this cave, not just a shelter. Everything she did was quiet, careful, and filled with purpose. Samuel felt the warmth of the fire on his back and the cold of the forest on his face. For a moment he stood there between the two worlds, the wild, open forest he came from, and this quiet cave where a stranger had allowed him to stay. She handed him a small wooden cup filled with warm water and herbs. He accepted it with both hands. The cup was smooth, made by hand, probably long ago. He took a small sip. It tasted soft and earthy, the warmth spreading through his chest like a gentle blanket. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. She nodded once again, not needing words. Samuel sat down near the fire, enjoying the small comfort. He wanted to leave and find his way back to the camp, but something in him didn't rush. This cave, this woman, this quiet morning, it felt like a pause in a life that was always moving too fast. The woman pointed toward the entrance. "River," she said simply. "North," he understood. She was reminding him of the way back. He would need to follow the river once the sun climbed higher. But before he could respond, a soft, unexpected sound reached their ears. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the crackle of fire. It was something else. A low creaking, like snow being pressed down under heavy weight. Both of them turned their heads toward the entrance at the same time. The sound grew louder, closer, the kind that made the air around them still. Samuel's heart gave a small jump. He had spent enough time in forest to know that the quietest places often carried the loudest surprises. The woman didn't panic. She didn't even move suddenly. Instead, she rose gracefully, wrapped her blanket around her shoulders, and walked toward the entrance with steady steps. Samuel followed slowly, his breath clouding in the cold air. When they stepped just close enough to see outside, the sight met them, a group of deer moving through the trees, their hooves pressing softly into the snow. Their coats were a soft brown against the white ground, and their breaths floated like tiny clouds. A tall buck led the way, its antlers wide and elegant like the branches of an old tree. Samuel let out the breath he had been holding. "Deer," he whispered, more to himself than to her. She nodded. "They come after storms," she said softly. "They trust the quiet." Her words painted a picture he understood. The animals knew the rhythm of the forest better than people ever could. They moved when it was safe, when the danger of the storm had passed. The deer didn't run when they saw the cave. They just moved slowly, peacefully, as if this was their land and they were only passing through. Samuel watched them with quiet wonder. The woman turned to him and said something in her language, words he didn't understand, but her voice was calm and warm. Then she added in English, "This is their path. They remember." Samuel had never thought of animals like that before, not as creatures that remembered paths, places, and stories, but it made sense. The way she said it made everything sound like it belonged together. The mountain, the deer, the cave, even them. She stepped outside a little, not afraid of the cold. Samuel followed, his boots crunching in the snow. The sun was slowly rising, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The deer continued their slow walk down the hill toward the frozen river. Their breath hung in the air, glowing in the sunlight. It was a quiet, peaceful moment, the kind that would stay in his memory for a long time. But what happened next made it unforgettable. The woman knelt down in the snow, placed her hand gently on the ground, and closed her eyes. Samuel didn't know what she was doing, but he didn't interrupt. She whispered something softly, a sound like a breeze moving through tall grass. Then she looked up at him. "The land listens," she said. Samuel didn't fully understand her words, but something in her eyes told him she meant it. This place wasn't just where she lived. It was a part of her. He looked at the forest again, at the white blanket of snow, the river hidden beneath the ice, the animals moving like quiet shadows. In that moment, the forest didn't feel like an enemy anymore. It felt alive. The woman stood and walked back to the cave. Samuel followed, feeling different than before. He felt like he had just witnessed something quiet but powerful, not loud or dramatic, but something that would stay with him forever. Inside the cave, the fire was still glowing warmly. The woman picked up a small basket made of willow branches and began sorting through dried herbs and roots. She worked with careful hands as if each piece was special. Samuel sat down and watched her. She moved with such grace and calm as if time didn't rush here. "I will leave soon," he said softly. She didn't look up but gave a small nod. "The river will guide you," he hesitated. "Thank you for letting me stay here, for the fire, for everything." She paused for a moment, then looked at him with eyes that held stories far older than his own. "The mountain gives to those who listen," she said. Samuel felt those words settle in his heart. She hadn't just given him shelter. She had shared something deeper, a way of seeing the world that he had never known. As he prepared to leave, he gathered his small pack and put on his gloves. He tied his scarf tightly and made sure his axe hung safely at his side. The woman handed him a small bundle wrapped in soft cloth. Inside were dried herbs, something to make warm water when he returned to the camp. "You will need this," she said simply. He accepted it carefully, as if receiving something precious. "I won't forget this," he whispered. She didn't reply, but her silence carried more meaning than words could. As he walked toward the entrance again, the sunlight touched his face and the cold air wrapped around him like a reminder of where he was. He looked back at her. She stood near the fire, calm and strong, as if she belonged to the cave as much as the stone walls and the flickering flames. Outside, the deer were now far away, just small shapes in the distance. The forest was quiet. The river waited somewhere ahead, ready to guide him home. Samuel stood there for a long moment, not because he was afraid to leave, but because something inside him had changed. He came to this cave as a lost man looking for warmth, but what he found was more than shelter. He found a piece of a world that most people rushed past without noticing. The woman met his eyes one last time and gave him a small nod, the same simple nod she had given him when he first offered the bread. But now it meant something much more. Then Samuel stepped into the snow. The cold bit his face, but it didn't bother him the way it did before. His steps were steady, sure. The forest no longer felt endless. He could hear the distant sound of the river flowing beneath the frozen surface. It would lead him north, back to camp. But even as he walked away, he knew a part of his heart would stay in that quiet cave, where a stranger had shared warmth, silence, and something even deeper: trust. The woman watched from the entrance until he disappeared behind the trees. Then she turned back to the fire, feeding it gently. Outside, the forest stretched on forever. Inside, the cave remained a warm island in the cold, waiting for the next winter wanderer who might need it. Samuel stepped out of the cave, and the cold air met him like a familiar friend. It was sharp, but no longer painful. The storm had passed, and the world felt quiet, as if it were holding its breath. The snow beneath his boots was fresh, smooth, and soft, untouched except for the delicate footprints left by the deer earlier that morning. The sun climbed slowly over the horizon, its light pale but golden. It spilled across the frozen forest, painting the tops of the pine trees with a faint glow. The wind moved gently, brushing against Samuel's face, carrying the clean smell of snow and earth. He tightened his scarf, adjusted the strap of his pack, and began to walk. Behind him, the cave grew smaller and smaller. He didn't turn back right away, but after a few steps, something made him stop. He turned, and there she was, and the woman. She stood at the cave entrance, wrapped in her deerskin blanket, her dark hair hanging in a single braid over her shoulder. She didn't wave, didn't call out. She simply stood there, watching him with the same quiet strength she had shown since the moment he entered her world. Samuel raised a hand slowly, not as a big gesture, but as a simple sign of respect. She gave him a small nod in return. That was enough. That single nod carried more meaning than any words they could have spoken. Then he turned back toward the forest and began his journey. The river was not far. He walked downhill, his boots crunching softly in the snow, and soon he saw a silver line shining between the trees. The water wasn't completely frozen. In some places, the river moved slowly beneath a thin sheet of ice, making a soft murmuring sound. It was the only sound in the forest. Samuel followed its winding path. The woman's words echoed in his mind. "The river will guide you." And it did. It curved through the forest like a quiet road made of water, leading him toward the north where his camp was waiting. The forest around him was still. Birds had not yet returned after the storm. Every step he took left a clear mark in the snow, and behind him his footprints stretched like a thin path. The cold air filled his lungs, and with each breath his body felt more awake. He thought about the woman as he walked, her calm voice, her steady eyes, the way she spoke as if the forest itself were alive. He had worked among trees for years, cutting them, hauling them, living in their shade. But he had never really listened to the forest before. To him it had always been wood and wind. To her it was something more, a friend, a teacher, a home. As he followed the river, he noticed things he had never paid attention to before. The way snow gathered on the rocks like soft white pillows, the faint sound of water moving beneath the ice, whispering secrets he couldn't quite understand, the gentle sway of tree branches in the breeze, like slow breathing. The forest felt different now, not because it had changed, but because he had. Hours passed as he walked, but he didn't feel tired the way he used to. Each step felt steady. The bundle of dried herbs she had given him was tucked safely in his coat, warm against his chest. He touched it once in a while, not because he needed to, but because it reminded him of the quiet cave, the fire, and the kindness he had been shown when he needed it most. Around midday, the sunlight grew brighter and the snow began to sparkle like tiny diamonds. Samuel paused near a bend in the river where a large fallen tree had created a natural bench of sorts. He sat down, breathing slowly, feeling the cold on his face and the warmth inside him. He pulled out a small piece of bread, what little he had left. But this time as he ate, it tasted different. Simple bread in the middle of the forest suddenly felt like a feast. He smiled quietly to himself. He thought about her life in that cave, how she had survived many winters alone, how she had built her own world, far from the noise and rush of people. He thought of how easily she had accepted the storm, the snow, and the silence. She wasn't just surviving. She was living with the land, not against it. Samuel realized something he had never truly felt before. The forest wasn't a thing to fear. It wasn't an enemy to fight. It was something to respect, something that gave as much as it took, if you listened closely enough. After a short rest, he rose and continued along the river. As the sun began to lower a little, he spotted something familiar in the distance, a broken fence post near a tall pine tree. It was the marker the lumberjacks used to guide themselves back to camp. A sense of calm relief washed over him. He was on the right path. But as much as he looked forward to the warmth of the campfire and the sound of human voices, a part of him already missed the stillness of the cave. It was strange, he thought. The cave had been cold and dark, but it had felt safe. Soon he heard faint sounds ahead, the distant rhythm of chopping wood, men talking, and the barking of the camp's old dog. He smiled softly to himself. Home wasn't far. When he finally reached the camp, a few of the men spotted him and called out his name. Their voices echoed through the trees, filled with surprise and relief. "Samuel, there you are," one of them shouted. "We thought you froze out there." Samuel laughed quietly, shaking the snow from his coat. "Not this time," he answered. They surrounded him, asking questions. Where had he been? How had he made it through the storm? What had he found? Samuel listened to their chatter with a small smile. But part of him didn't want to explain everything. Some stories, he thought, were better carried quietly inside. He told them only the simple part. "I found a cave," he said. "It kept me warm through the night." The men nodded, impressed. "Lucky man," one said. "Storm like that would have frozen you solid out here." Samuel just smiled. It wasn't luck. It was something more. That evening, as the sky turned a soft blue and the fire in the camp crackled brightly, Samuel sat near the flames with a cup of warm water. He had used some of the herbs the woman had given him. As the scent of sage filled the air, the other men looked at him curiously. "What's that smell?" one of them asked. Samuel inhaled deeply. "It's good," he said softly. They laughed, shaking their heads. But Samuel didn't mind. The warm scent reminded him of her quiet cave, of her steady hands feeding the fire, of the moment when two strangers had shared a small piece of bread without saying many words. The stars came out one by one, shining brightly above the tall pines. Samuel leaned back and looked at them. He thought of her again, standing at the entrance, the wind in her hair, the firelight behind her. The forest was vast. The cave was small. And yet it had changed something inside him. Over the next days, Samuel returned to his work. He cut wood, hauled logs, and shared meals with the other lumberjacks. But he moved differently now, slower, more aware. When the wind rushed through the trees, he no longer ignored it. He listened. When he walked near the river, he didn't rush. He watched the way it curved through the land. His fellow workers noticed something in him. "You seem quiet these days," one of them said. Samuel smiled faintly. "Just listening," he replied. They didn't understand, and that was all right. They didn't need to. Each night, when the campfire burned low and the men drifted off to sleep, Samuel sat a little longer, holding the small bundle of herbs she had given him. He didn't know her name, and she didn't know much about him. Yet their brief meeting had left a mark deeper than any words could. Sometimes he imagined the cave at night, the fire glowing softly, the woman wrapped in her blanket, the wind whispering at the entrance. He pictured the deer passing by again after the next storm. Life in the forest would go on just as it always had, quiet and strong. He didn't know if he would ever see her again. But he didn't need to. Her kindness had given him something that would stay with him no matter where he went. A quiet strength, a respect for the world around him, and the memory of a warm fire on a cold night. Weeks passed and winter began to soften. The snow melted slowly, revealing the dark earth beneath. The river grew louder as the ice cracked and drifted away. Spring would come soon, and with it, the busy noise of the forest waking up again. But Samuel carried that winter night with him like a gentle flame. Something quiet, steady, and unshakable. And sometimes when he walked through the forest alone, he would glance at the hills in the distance, where the cave lay hidden among the rocks. He didn't go back. Not because he couldn't, but because some places are meant to stay in the heart, untouched and whole. Winter slowly faded into spring, as it always did in the forest. The snow melted bit by bit, flowing into the river that had guided Samuel home weeks ago. The trees, once covered in white, began to wear soft green again. Small buds appeared on branches, and tiny drops of water slid down the bark as the sun grew warmer each day. The camp where Samuel worked became livelier with the change of season. New lumberjacks arrived, bringing loud laughter and stories. The sound of axes striking wood echoed through the forest from morning to dusk. The smell of pine and sawdust filled the air. Life at the camp returned to its fast rhythm, busy and full of noise. But Samuel was different. He worked the same long days as everyone else, but inside something had changed. He noticed things he hadn't before. He noticed the way sunlight slipped between the tall trees in the early morning. He noticed how the river spoke softly when the wind was quiet. He even noticed the still moments at night when the campfire burned low and the forest seemed to breathe. No one else saw these little things the way he did, and that was fine. They didn't have to. The forest had shown something to him alone, on that cold winter night. Or maybe it wasn't the forest itself, maybe it was her. He often thought about the woman in the cave, the way she sat near the fire without fear, the way her voice carried calm, the way she treated the forest as something alive, something to be respected. He had known many people in his life, strong men, loud talkers, quick thinkers. But none had left an impression as quiet and lasting as she had. He didn't even know her name. But he remembered her nod, her silence, her strength. One late afternoon, after a long day of cutting trees, Samuel walked alone by the river. The sun was setting, painting the water gold. The camp was behind him, its noise fading with distance. He walked slowly, letting his boots sink into the soft earth where the snow had melted. The wind was gentle, almost warm. He crouched near the water's edge, looking at the ripples. The same river that had guided him home now carried the sounds of spring, the soft chatter of flowing water, and the songs of birds that had returned after the winter storms. Samuel reached into his pocket and touched the small bundle of herbs the woman had given him. He had kept it safe all this time. The scent had faded a little, but it still carried something warm, something that reminded him of that night, the cave, the fire, the quiet trust between two strangers. He closed his eyes and let the sound of the river fill his ears. It was strange how something as simple as water could carry so much memory. It had been his guide, his path, and now it felt like an old friend. As weeks turned into months, life went on. Trees were cut, logs were hauled, wagons rolled down the muddy paths, but Samuel began to spend more time alone in the forest, not to escape, but to listen. Sometimes when he walked far from camp, he would find quiet places where the wind hummed softly between the trees. He would sit there for hours, not thinking about work or worries, but just being still, the same way she had been still by the fire. He learned to move more gently, to leave fewer marks on the ground, to listen before stepping. He even began to learn the signs of the forest, when animals were near, when a storm was coming, when the wind changed. It was as if a small part of her world had slowly become part of his. One evening, as the sky turned purple and orange, he sat with a few of the other men around the campfire. They laughed and talked loudly, telling stories of old adventures and imagined legends. Samuel usually listened quietly, but that night something inside him stirred. One of the men said, "Samuel, you've been quiet for months now. What happened to you that night in the storm? You found something out there, didn't you?" The others laughed lightly, but they were curious. Samuel looked at the flames for a long time before answering. The firelight reflected in his eyes, reminding him of the cave. "I found a cave," he said slowly. "And someone was already there." The laughter stopped. "Someone?" Another man asked. "Who?" He didn't give them every detail. Some stories were not meant to be broken down into small, ordinary pieces. Some were meant to be felt, not told. "She lived there," Samuel said softly. "Quiet, strong. She shared her fire with me when the storm could have taken everything away. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't have to." The men exchanged looks. "An old woman? A hunter? A trapper?" Samuel shook his head with a small smile. "Someone who belongs to the forest more than we ever will." The men didn't know what to say. Some shrugged it off as just another tale to warm a cold night. Others grew thoughtful for a moment. But none of them truly understood what he meant. And Samuel didn't expect them to. That night, after everyone drifted off to sleep, Samuel stayed by the dying fire, staring at the embers. He didn't need anyone to understand. It was his story to keep. Years passed. Samuel grew older, as all men do. His shoulders remained strong, but his hair turned silver like the river in winter. He spent many seasons in the forest, learning from its silence. The other lumberjacks came and went, but Samuel stayed longer than most. He became known as the man who could read the signs of the forest, who knew when the snow would come early, when the rivers would flood, when the wind would shift. When young workers joined the camp, they often asked him how he learned to move through the woods so easily. He would smile faintly and say, "I listened." Some laughed, thinking it was just his way of avoiding a long explanation. But sometimes, when the night was quiet and the fire burned low, he would tell them the story, not with big dramatic words, but softly, like a memory carried by the wind. He told them about the winter storm, the cave, and the woman who lived alone in the mountains. He never described her in full. He never said her name because he never knew it. But he spoke of her calmness, her respect for the land, and how that night changed the way he saw the forest forever. Many didn't understand. A few did. And for those who listened closely, the story lived on. On a quiet spring morning many years later, Samuel walked alone along the same river. His steps were slower now but steady. The forest was alive around him, birds calling, leaves whispering, water singing. He followed the curve of the river without needing to think. His feet remembered the path. When he reached the bend where he had once rested after leaving the cave, he stopped. He could see the distant hills where the cave lay hidden. He didn't need to go there. Just looking toward it was enough. He stood there for a long time, breathing in the forest air. A soft breeze brushed against his face, and for a moment, it felt like the same breeze that had touched him years ago on the day he left the cave. He closed his eyes, and it was as if he was back there again, standing in the snow, with her watching him quietly, the fire behind her, the river ahead. That image lived inside him like a lantern that never went out. Samuel whispered softly, not to anyone around him, but to the forest itself, "Thank you." Then he turned and walked back down the path, the sound of the river following him like an old friend. Long after Samuel's time in the forest ended, people still told stories about him. They spoke of the lumberjack who listened to the wind, who moved quietly like the deer, who understood the forest in ways few others did. Some said he had met a spirit of the mountains. Others said he had simply learned to see the world more clearly than most. But Samuel knew the truth. He had met a woman, not a spirit, not a ghost, a real woman who lived with the land. Her kindness, given without asking for anything in return, had changed the shape of his life. The cave remained where it always had been, quiet and hidden. Perhaps she still lived there, or perhaps time had taken her elsewhere. But her presence lingered like the soft scent of sage carried on the wind. And so Samuel's story became more than a memory. It became a quiet lesson whispered through the forest, a reminder that kindness can live in the most unexpected places, that silence can speak louder than words, and that sometimes a single night can change the way a person walks through the world. Even as new men came and old ones left, the river kept flowing, the trees kept growing, and the forest remained what it had always been: strong, quiet, and full of stories. And somewhere in the cold breath of winter or the soft warmth of spring, the memory of that cave, and the woman who lived there, was still alive.